Welcome to the Rainbow Bridge National Monument viewing area. Slightly unpretentious, isn't it? But somehow it seems appropriate for visitors, most of whom have traveled 50 plus miles by boat, to disembark at dock and walk over a mile up a beautiful canyon trail, to be received by an ambiance which reflects the isolated slice of the Colorado Canyon Plateau country that they've arrived in. Actually, the setting wasn't that much different for the earliest visitors to Rainbow Bridge. I should say the earliest Anglo visitors to Rainbow Bridge, but their trip here definitely was different. There are varying accounts of this expedition depending upon particularly what party the individual came from. I'll share with you today the account that I most subscribe to. Let me share with you a little bit about that great American saga. It starts with a man named John Wetherill. John was raised at the base of Mesa Verde in Mancos, Colorado. He was a tough and hardened Westerner, I mean a desert he-man. He and his wife, Louisa, had moved to an incredibly remote trading post about 60 miles from the east of here called Oljeto. They were warned not to go there in the first place because there were probably Native Americans out here who had never seen an Anglo before. But the locals, particularly the Paiutes and the Navajos, took real liking to this couple. John was given the name Hostine John. Hostine in Navajo simply means man. But Man John, probably the modern day equivalent of you're the man. Louisa was adopted into the Navajo Nation by a Navajo leader and singer named Hashkinani. And actually it was Louisa in 1908 who was told by a Navajo named One-Eyed Man of the Salt Plain that there was some huge bridge down here in this near the Colorado River in the first place. Well, she told her husband John. He told his buddy, the University of Utah professor, Byron Cummings, also a dean there, and one of the fathers of archaeology as a science in the Southwest. And he told the federal surveyor, William Douglas, out of the General Land Office in Bluff. Well, they organized a group to come back in here. And that trip down here from Salt Lake City, do you think it might have been a little bit different for them in 1909? Well, the first part was by train to Thompson Springs above present-day Interstate 70. They then went by stagecoach to Monticello, Utah, and then disembarked by pack train through Blanding and Bluff, Utah, and on to Oljeto. Now, the University of Utah group held out for 2 days at Oljeto, waiting on the tardy federal man's party. They actually had disembarked from Oljeto. A rider caught up with them and assured them that Douglas had arrived. Douglas rendezvoused with them, and that group, 12 strong, disembarked from just this side of Oljeto around 4:30 a.m., August 10th, 1909. Now, the first 3 days, they went to very hot, arid, chiseled canyon country. And by the fourth day, they arrived at some incredible matrices of canyon works. I'd like you to join me for the rest of the story at the first viewing area, just down the trail. Fourth day, they started about 18 miles from here, the far side, northeast side of Navajo Mountain, by the site of what would become the old Navajo Mountain Trading Post. That day, they traveled through a vast carved canyon wilderness that I experienced myself a couple of years ago, and I've never felt so detached from human beings in my life. It was incredible. By that fourth night, they'd arrived above the upper reaches of Bridge Canyon. They were being led by White Mesa Ute Jim Mike. That night, there were most of the members of the party who were discouraged, disgruntled, hot. Did I mention it was August? They didn't think Jim Mike knew where it was at, much less this supposed bridge. And I have to tell you, I think this was a case of broken English, because you would not find your way to that spot by accident. There should have been a ball of cheese hanging by their campfire that night, because they'd been through a maze. Well, about 10:30 that night, Najd Begay, a San Juan Southern Paiute who'd been recruited by Byron Cummings, showed up at their campfire. He assured them that the bridge was a half-day ride ahead. Well, the next day they wake up, they got a bounce in their step, they're exuberant, and it's kind of humorous. Douglas, the federal man, was pretty fond of himself. He argued for decades that he was the rightful discoverer of the bridge and the leader of the party. He was at the head of the pack a lot of the day, brushing people out of the way on his horse. Why? well, maybe he wanted to be the first Anglo to see Rainbow Bridge. But in his haste, in a huge oxbow bend over a mile from the bridge, he went right past a spot where it was visible. And being deaf, he didn't hear the commotion going on behind him for a little bit. Virtually deaf, he'd hold a funnel up to his ear to hear instructions, but he turned around, and here were a bunch of men gathered because Byron Cummings had been the first Anglo to look up and say, "Eureka! There she is." And John Wetherill, also an excellent horseman, raced around Douglas to be the first Anglo underneath the bridge. And that was about 12 noon, August 14th, 1909. Now, to give you an idea of just how junkyard dog tough that University of Utah group were, including 11-year-old Malcolm Cummings, Byron's son, they walked the 6 miles down to the Colorado River that day and got back up after midnight. They had to leave the next day. They had prior commitments to survey at newly set-aside Navajo National Monument. I will say this for William Douglas, he stayed on for 2 days in this hot sun and surveyed the 160 acres that still serves as a monument boundary today. Took information about the rock oval altar under the bridge, which in the 1990s, wood fragments from the base were carbon dated to 540 AD, give or take 60 years. This information that Douglas sent back to the General Land Office, well, I believe it was maybe former President Theodore Roosevelt, who was one who helped give it a push over to William Howard Taft's desk from the General Land Office. And 9 months later, William Howard Taft stroked a pen. He might as well have shot that arm of American preservation out onto Mars. But he did set this place aside, May 30th, 1910. Now, in the early days, you came in here with John Wetherill, for the most part, from Ojeto and then finally Kayenta, Arizona. And he let in Zane Grey in May of 1913, Teddy Roosevelt in August of 1913. But in 19, he met a man named Charles Bernheimer, who paid Wetherill to lead archaeological expeditions into this rich treasure cove of antiquity beyond Rainbow Bridge. And Bernheimer became obsessed with the idea of getting a trail in from the southwest side of rugged Navajo Mountain. Well, in 1923, Bernheimer persuaded Wetherill to blast with dynamite for 6 days in Redbud Pass of Redbud Canyon, about 6 miles from the bridge. And they successfully established a trail from the southwest side of Navajo Mountain. And Wetherill essentially shot himself in the foot as a guide, because a pair of brothers from Missouri decided to capitalize on this newly established trail and built the most remote lodge in the country, in the lower 48, I should say, at the trailhead of native rocks, clays, timbers, and soils. Rainbow Lodge. They started bringing people in 1924 at $20 a head per night. A lot of money back then. And they stayed at a beautiful alcove called Echo Camp about a mile from the bridge, which had a seat pool with cattails and cottonwoods and redbuds, and lots of shade. Well, this lodge switched hands a couple times. And in 1947, a man you might have heard of who went on to be a senator from Arizona, that's right, Barry Goldwater, purchased half ownership of the lodge. He was quite a wrangler. If you crawled over Redbud Pass today, you would see why skeletons of pack animals were found there in the old days. Well, Barry co-owned this lodge till 1951, at which point Rainbow Lodge burnt to the ground, and a great American slice of Americana went with it. Barry blamed the fire on a cowboy smoking in the bathroom. Barry said the best that he did in 5 years was lose $500. But you know, it seems that earlier visitors to the bridge spoke with such passion about it. I hope it's not because we've changed as a people. I hope it's more that they paid in sweat and toil to get here. But in 1929, Zane Grey, in his last of 4 visits, wrote, "Long after the race of man has passed, it would perhaps stand there still. Alone, grand, silent, unintelligible. It was not for the leisurely motorist to see. Only by sweat, toil, endurance, and pain would anyone lay eyes upon Nanazoshi, and as such I bade it a mute, reverent farewell." Modern-day visitors are still inspired by their visits to Rainbow Bridge, and I hope someday soon you will be too. Thank you.